Hello guys, and welcome back to the channel where I present you this official Red Hat 5.2 Linux operating system. In this video we're going to be taking a look inside the box, look at the hardware that we will use to install Linux on, both on the outside and the inside, do the actual Linux installation, and look at some cool software, including some popular window managers from back in the day. Now, I recently picked up a copy of Red Hat 5.2, software that I owned 22 years ago and that I will now install on a 25-year-old computer. Now, with this version of Red Hat Linux, it became pretty easy to get it installed on a computer. It had broad support for hardware and it was basically just a next finish type of installation. So let's take a closer look at what is in the box and what's on the box. So here we have the promise of the Linux desktop user interface, a desktop environment that could in fact compete with Windows. But obviously it also had lots of other things going for it, like internet tools, networking connectivity, development, and the system requirements weren't all that heavy either. So this could run on a 386, 486 Pentium, and that's what we are going to be doing today. But first, let's take a look inside the box and see what we have inside here. And we'll start with the CDs that came with this distribution. So there were 3 CDs in total. And the first CD contained the setup program and all of the applications that were needed to run Linux. And also remember this 90-day free support that you got for installation issues with Red Hat. The second CD contained all of the application source code. So Linux being one of the most popular open source projects out there, every application that came with Linux also came with source code. And finally, there was this application CD, which contained some commercial software demos. Don't think a lot of these were a big hit, especially not in the consumer market. Now, Red Hat also came with a boot diskette, and this is needed for systems that didn't have the ability to boot from CD-ROM. Although Red Hat did offer bootable CD-ROMs, a lot of systems didn't have the capability to do so. We also had some Linux Red Hat swag here and some other pieces of paper. Red Hat Linux also came with an installation guide giving you some more information on how to install, what to pay attention to. So this was before the internet was very popular. I mean, a lot of people were still using modems to get onto the internet, and having a book like this was really handy. Now onto the machine where we are going to be installing it on, and I have selected this Pentium 100 system from SCOM. Comes with a CD-ROM, a disk drive to boot Red Hat. It has an Intel Pentium 100 CPU. We have parallel serial ports, a VGA port, and a networking card. Now, this computer is an SCOM computer, and SCOM being the company not only known for being the owner of the sex.com domain name at some point, but it was also the company that bought the Commodore brand. Taking a look inside in the PC, we have an Intel Pro 100 networking card. So this should be well supported in Linux, so we shouldn't have any issues with that. The video card that we have here is an ATI Mac 64. And back in the day, it was important to have a video card that was well supported in Linux because not every vendor had Linux drivers. But this ATI card is well supported in Linux, so we shouldn't have any issues with this one. We have 64 megabytes of RAM. We have an Intel motherboard and an Intel CPU. So this is a 100 megahertz CPU. It only came with a heatsink. I do think that at some point there was a fan installed, but I have the impression that this computer has been running for a long time without the fan. There seems to be some kind of residue on the CPU here. Perhaps it was thermal paste or something, but I will be installing a fan on this one. Let's take our boot disk, insert it in the PC, because this PC is not able to boot from a CD-ROM drive. So if we go into the BIOS, it has detected the CD-ROM drive, but when we go into boot options, the only items that we can select here are floppy, hard disk, and network. So let's insert the boot disk, turn on the computer, and let it boot from the boot disk. And we are welcomed by this little screen here, giving us some information. Now, I do want to issue a small word of caution that it's probably not a good idea to install a 22-year-old operating system and then hook that up to the internet. So make sure that you make the proper arrangements in terms of firewall settings, because you can say a lot of things about Red Hat 5.2, but I wouldn't call it the most secure operating system today. We hit enter so that we can boot up the whole installation program. So you will hear the disk drive doing its thing. The installer will start by creating a RAM disk so that it can load the kernel in there from the CD-ROM and then expand it so that it will launch the installer. And it's always nice to see the kernel getting uncompressed and loaded like this, with all kinds of information scrolling down the screen, ultimately coming in this welcome to Red Hat Linux screen. The installation is straightforward. After selecting a language, keyboard layout, installation method, it will spin up the CD-ROM drive that should by now contain your Red Hat CD-ROM and will prompt you to do an install. We select a custom machine, we don't have any SCSI adapters, and we're going to be using DiskDruid to set up and partition our hard drive. So here I have a 1.6 gigabyte hard drive installed. I'm going to be deleting all of the existing partitions. I'm going to be adding a Linux swap partition, and then use the rest of the available disk space to mount a Linux native file system on the root file system. After that, we will be prompted to save the partition table and format both the swap partition as well as the root file system partition. Next up, we can choose the components that we want to install. I'm going to be adding some DOS Windows connectivity, some games, multimedia. I'm going to be adding the SMB connectivity, add a web server, a SQL server, some networking stuff, and some C development libraries. And after that, the installer will attempt to create the file system on our hard drive, and we will hear the hard drive doing its thing. If you want to know what the installer is doing behind the scenes, you can always press Alt and one of the function keys to see the content on a different console and see more depth information. For example, here you can see that it's trying to make a file system on the hard drive, creating swap space. So that's always nice to see when the installer is doing something, to see what exactly is going on behind the scenes. And here it's almost finished creating the file system on our hard drive. And then it will continue installing the packages that we have selected. And although everything went well and everything seemed to be installing just fine, all of a sudden we hit a little roadblock. All of a sudden we got this little pop-up here that says input-output error, installation failed. So when again using the Alt keys to see more in-depth information, we saw all kinds of nasty stuff here. Seek complete data request error, all kinds of hard drive related issues. And wouldn't you know it, the hard drive just died on us. So with a brand new hard drive in place, we went through the exact same steps that we just did. And this time, all of the packages that we selected were installed successfully. There were no errors. It took about, I think, 12 minutes to install the entire thing. The CD-ROM drive was doing its thing, and the hard drive was also working really hard. But all in all, the installation went just fine. We're reaching the end of the installation, and now it's probing for a mouse that it's for some reason not able to find. I have a serial mouse attached to the computer, but I have to manually select it. So I'm just going to be selecting a generic serial mouse here. We will emulate the third button, and it's installed in COM1. It has also detected our video card, which is the Mac 64, so it will install an X server specifically supporting this type of ATI card. So this is the X386 Mach 64 X server. We need to set up our monitor as well, and that's very important. So we need to set up the correct horizontal and vertical sync rates, because otherwise it will not be able to display certain resolutions. So in this case, I'm going to be going for the non-interlaced SVGA and select this vertical sync here. Now, Linux can probe certain PCI video cards to determine stuff like memory and then provide an optimal configuration for it. But in my case, it wasn't able to probe the video card, so I had to do it manually. So here I'm specifying 1 megabyte of memory, and I am also going to be selecting the video modes that I want to support. We're also going to be configuring our network, so not the modem, but the networking card inside the computer, and it has found our Intel Ether Express Pro 100 card, and it has done so by probing the PCI bus, and there it has found the Ethernet device. So it has loaded up the EEPRO 100 kernel module, and that will provide us with the necessary support to get this networking card up and running in Linux. So it has detected the physical connector as well, the RJ45. And we will configure the networking card to use DHCP so that it is able to get an IP address from my router. So some final formalities, the time zone configuration, the services that we want to have started automatically upon boot. We're not going to be configuring a printer, but we are going to be setting a root password. We don't want to have a boot disk now, but we will be installing Lilo, which is the bootloader. And that's it. Installation complete. We can remove the boot disk from the PC, do a restart, and it should boot straight into our Linux environment. And the fact that you could see all of those nitty-gritty details when the system was starting, it was just mesmerizing. I mean, half of the stuff I didn't really understand, but the fact that you could see all of this low-level stuff was really a game changer for me coming from a Microsoft environment. So finally we're at the login prompt. So let's log in with our root user. And the first command I'm going to enter is start X, which will launch X Windows, the graphical user interface provided by this Linux distribution. Now, by default, it starts in a rather low resolution, 640 by 480, but it does provide you with a virtual desktop, which has a resolution of 1024 by 768. So here we have some control panels provided by Red Hat. Let's launch XIs. Here they are, classic. So this is running a Windows manager called FVWM. And I think this is one of those patched ones or configured ones to look like Windows 95, because as you can see, the icons to minimize, maximize, and close windows strongly resemble the Windows 95 icons. So I think this was kind of meant to familiarize users with the desktop, not to scare them away, and give them something that they knew from their Microsoft environment. So Windows environment comes with a number of utilities like packet managers, and we also have some graphic programs, some games, some utilities. Some of the utilities are rather difficult to use. For example, this text editor, no idea why they made this thing so complicated. I mean, would it hurt to show a dialogue or make it clear to the user where they need to type text? I mean, but this wasn't the only window manager that people could use. For the second time, Red Hat came with GNOME, with a technology preview release of the GNOME desktop project. Now, it wasn't installed or enabled by default, but it was on the CD-ROM. In order to get GNOME installed, you needed to follow a couple of steps. Now, the first thing you needed to do was to install X Screensaver, and that comes from the Red Hat CD. So using RPM, we're going to be installing X Screensaver because this is, to my knowledge, one of the few dependencies that GNOME actually has after installing a Red Hat distribution. So once X Screensaver has been installed, we can go to the GNOME folder on the Red Hat CD, execute the install GNOME command, and we should be off. So this will install a couple of packages. Again, these are preview packages of GNOME. This is not a 1.0 version. I think this is the first version of GNOME that was actually released to the public and that was made easy for people to install. So here it is installing all of the packages. And once that is done, you would think that, okay, I can now start X and start to use GNOME, but that's not the case. So installing GNOME alone is not enough. You need to run this script to set some images in the correct format. And then what you also need to do is create a X configuration file called xinitrc. And there you need to type in the following commands in order for the GNOME panel to show up and launch a window manager with a specific GNOME configuration, which can also be found on the CD. So that's it, nothing more. And then when you start X, you will get a new Windows experience, still on top of FVWM window manager that we just saw. But you will see that the icons are different. The start menu is completely different. There are different apps made available via the start menu. So it's a completely new experience when it comes to the Windows-based environment. Now there was a third window manager that I really wanted to install, and that's because I have fond memories of it, and it's called Enlightenment. Now, Enlightenment was one of those Windows manager that was far ahead of its time. I remember, being a youngster, I was fascinated by these cool user interfaces, these transparent terminals that you saw popping up on the internet, the cool backgrounds, the cool icons, and that just wasn't really possible with the standard window managers that were provided by most of the Linux distributions. So for that, you needed to have the Enlightenment window manager created by Karsten Heitzler. Hope I pronounced this correctly, better known perhaps by his nickname Rasterman in the open source community, an Australian-German software engineer, pictured here with a cowboy hat alongside Jeff Harrison, also a very popular figure in the open source community, perhaps better known as Mandrake, and who both have still important roles in the tech community overall. And back in the day, this was really cool stuff. This was a window manager which focused a lot on eye candy. It was very impressive to see, and the mere thought that a mere mortal was able to program such a thing, especially for myself as a youngster also starting out in software development, it was really inspirational to a certain degree that people were able to create products and technologies like this. It was really mind-blowing for me at the time. And luckily we can still download an old version of Enlightenment using the archive.download.redhat.com website, where we go into the 5.2 folder of Red Hat, go into the Power Tools folder, and there you will see a bunch of RPMs under the Intel 386 folder, and Enlightenment is one of those RPMs that you can download from there. So if we scroll down, it should be alphabetically, we have Enlightenment version 0.14. So we're going to go ahead and download that. It's a single RPM that you need to download. But as with a lot of RPMs in Red Hat, it's not sufficient to only download this one, because this one has a number of dependencies to other packages. So for example, here we need fnlib, esound, gtk plus Perl. So we need to download all of these dependencies separately. So luckily for us, this can also be done using the same site. So we'll just go ahead and download all of these packages that we need. We have esound here, the GTK stuff. And once we have all of these RPMs here, we can just install them one by one. And then install Enlightenment, which runs perfectly fine. And when you start it, you will get to see something like this. And to me, I mean, as a kid, this was one of the coolest things that was out there. It was way cooler than Windows 95. I mean, just look at those title bars and weird icons and colors and stuff. It was magic. I mean, the fact that somebody was able to create this. And it also came with a new terminal called eTerm, and you could make the background transparent and stuff. I mean, it was just mind-boggling. I mean, this was unbelievable, and it could be tweaked all over the place. It was a real fun and creative time. It was very labor intensive also, because especially for the first versions, there were no RPM packages, or at least none that really worked. So you often needed to download stuff from source, download tarballs, compiling the stuff, making sure that you were able to fetch the appropriate libraries, dependencies that also didn't came in RPM format, so you needed to download and build those also. And that about wraps it up for this first installment of the Red Hat 5.2 Linux installation. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I had making this video. It was a real throwback in time for me. It was especially nice being able to install this on actual hardware from back in the day. I think this Pentium 100 was a perfect match for this operating system. So again, as always, thanks a lot for tuning in. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Please give it a like, drop a comment below. If you like other content, please check out the other videos in my channel. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and I hope to see you guys soon. Bye bye.